Hi, Paul.
Hey,
How are
Ville.
you doing this morning?
I'm doing good. Yeah. Actually, Ville, I called my bank the other day to pay some bills. And the customer advisor on the other end of the line told me to stand on one leg. She said she had to check my balance before she could settle any of my payments.
Oh, God. Remind me again, why do we do these jokes in the beginning?
To lighten the mood.
All right, okay. Consider the mood lightened, and off we go. Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Fintech Daydreaming, the podcast that dives into the world of banking technologies and the ever-changing landscape of fintech companies, with real-life examples from guests and experts across the board. We seek to bring you the insights and stories from new emerging technologies to game-changing disruptive ideas brought to us by fintech companies seeking to challenge the status quo with revolutionary ideas and big fantastic dreams. My friends, this is Fintech Daydreaming. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to the show. I can't really believe it's already episode 4. I mean, really feels like we started this thing just yesterday. I guess time flies when you're having fun. In case you're interested in hearing what we talked about in the first 3 episodes of Fintech Daydreaming, you can find us now on all major podcast platforms like Apple, Google, Spotify, and now even on YouTube. My name is Ville, Sointu, and it's my turn to host the show today. I'm joined, as always, by my wonderful co-host, Paul. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Ville.
How's your midsummer preparations going?
Fantastic. Actually, I almost had forgotten. I allowed people to book meetings on Friday into my calendar. Then I had to go back and obviously, cancel all of them and get rid of them because it's sacrilege, right, to work on midsummer.
That's right. Midsummer in the Nordics is a tradition that usually starts at summer vacation period. But hey, let's get to the topic of today, so we don't just do small talk on the podcast. So
that would be good.
Today we're covering a topic that's very close to me, both from professional and personal perspective, and that's really the story of an entrepreneurship. There's a lot of fintech companies that join this scene wanting to disrupt. They feel that, like we discussed in a couple of the previous episodes in many occasions, they come to this world and they want to apply new technologies. They've been perhaps using banking services in one way or another for a while, and they think that, I can do better. I can really do better than this without really understanding the complexity of building financial services with all the security and compliance requirements that comes with it. Now, there are exceptions, of course. Fintech daydreamers, most of them fail to answer the challenge of financial services, but some actually succeed in this. This is an incredibly complicated space, and nobody ever becomes close to mastering it completely. The financial services space is intuitively and naturally very competitive, risk-averse, and highly regulated, obviously. So it's really easy to understand why so many people are kind of puzzled in front of this challenge. There's one person, however, who I know, I'm lucky to know, who has had incredible success in facing all of these challenges that I rambled through just now. He's actually done what some people might think is next to impossible. He was part of or a key person in building a successful multi-bank network for the Finnish real estate market and really started from scratch with nothing but talent and ambition to take him forward. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our guest today, Sami Honkonen. Did I pronounce that correctly, Sami?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Hello.
See, Paul. Finnish is not that hard. In fact, I heard. I learned to speak Finnish. Even before I went to school. It's not really that complicated. Sami is the CEO and founder of Tomorrow Technologies and Dias. Dias being the Finnish real estate trading network that I just mentioned. How are you doing today, Sami?
I am good. Today is actually the day of our company's summer party, so I'm really excited about the day.
Oh, summer parties in COVID times. Sounds like an interesting challenge.
Yep.
I'm more interested in knowing what happened to our invitations, Sami.
They're in the mail.
Sami has an interesting background, obviously, and I'm going to let him properly talk about his background as well very soon. But one of the interesting things that I learned about Sami earlier was that he's actually a lead singer in a death metal band. Now, obviously, we're in for Finland, like we mentioned now several times in the podcast already. But one of the fun statistical facts about Finland is that there's a very high density of death metal bands in Finland. And I guess, it's almost like statistically probable that one of us three is a member of a death metal band. And now we finally did it. So we have a death metal band singer in the podcast as well.
Yeah, I guess we don't have plans for doing any death metal on this episode, but maybe next time.
Yeah, maybe we can put that, some kind of a link in the show notes, perhaps later for some material if our listeners are interested in understanding what does a CEO sound like in a death metal band. But I guess looking at the topic of today, which is to talk about how do you build something complicated from scratch in the fintech space, and we need to start from the beginning, especially for the listeners outside Finland. Sami, could you talk about Dias? What is it and why does it matter?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I just kind of, it feels weird to be introduced as a success story when at the same time, I know we've gotten to a certain point, which is really great that we are here, but I still feel that we're kind of only at the very beginning of our journey. But so what Dias is and what it does is basically it enables a digital process for selling and buying apartments. So currently, for example, if you don't use Dias, currently how you do a real estate trade is that you have to set a meeting in a bank and you need to get all the different parties present. You need to get all the buyers and the sellers and the real estate agent and the bank officials in the same meeting room, sign a bunch of documents and do all kinds of things. And what we enable is that you can just skip all of that. You can just do the whole thing digitally, and you don't need to set up a meeting if you don't want to. You can still have the meeting if you want to, but then once again, you're not restricted by so many schedules because you can just have the meeting without the bank, for example. You can just have it at the new apartment or at the real estate agent's office. So that's essentially what Dias offers.
Yeah, and I think being here in Finland and having done some of these real estate deals myself, buying apartments in Finland, it is or used to be a very, very manual process. Some of the more interesting stories I've heard now that it's you can actually do it in a digital with a digital process are actually quite some funny stories. I heard. Someone made an altitude record for signing a real estate deal or buying an apartment by doing that on an airplane. Is that right?
Yeah. So there has been someone who started a trade in an airplane. There has been people who have signed documents while picking up blueberries in the forest and all kinds of weird stuff that this new thing enables. And you can also see it in our statistics that actually. But like there's a spike in the number of signatures that happen after 9 o'clock in the evening. And my guess is that what happens here is that now that you don't have to schedule it for a meeting that happens during your meeting during your work day, then what you do is that you put your kids to sleep, and then after 9 o'clock you have some time to go through the documents once more, and then you sign them. So that's also something that I think is also really changing how we do, how we sell and buy our apartments.
Yeah, that's right. I think Dias really found a problem and solved it. I think that's the reason why you're seeing some of these interesting stories happening and why the process now has changed so much. I think it answers a need.
Yeah, and I think what's kind of interesting about the whole thing is that we didn't start out to build it the way that it now exists. So there was a new law that was coming into effect in 2019. When we started building this in 2016, we already knew that there's a new law coming in 2019 that would change these paper certificates that Finland currently uses to prove ownership of an apartment, that they would digitalize these. And we were thinking that we're going to build solutions that are based on this new law. But then the government IT systems turned out to be very late, and we ended up having to come up with a process that would still support the paper certificates while at the same time providing a digital experience for the consumers and for the real estate agents. And I think that's also been one interesting part of the journey of like how we kind of realized that we have to change the whole plan midway through.
But I understand that part of the success is or the secret sauce is the adoption of blockchain technology as well.
Yeah. So if we kind of get back to the whole beginning of how we started this, when we started our company Tomorrow Tech in 2016, we actually decided to start a company, but we decided that we're not going to decide what we're going to do. So that was a fairly unconventional way of starting a business. We simply decided that we're going to start experimenting with a bunch of stuff and see what comes up. And one of the things that we started experimenting with very early on was blockchain. So we were really interested in blockchain technology. And basically what you can do is you can pick any blockchain book and look up like top examples of like use cases for blockchain. And real estate is probably on that top 5 list. So we were reading through the books and realizing that, or looking at the examples and thinking that, okay, how could we do real estate using blockchain in Finland? And that's kind of where we started selling the idea to the banks that maybe this would be something that we should try out. And one of the people that we started selling this to was Ville.
So this was really, a business idea born out of the technology rather than the technology following the business plan or business idea, right?
Yeah, you are exactly right, and we openly admit to that we kind of came at the technology first, whereas in general, I think that's not a very good principle to follow. But in this case, how we did it, we had the technology first, and we had a hammer, and we were looking for nails.
Yes.
Now that we mentioned the B word, I cannot help myself. I have to point out a couple of things that I think sets Dias apart a little bit from what I would consider more of the kind of hot air companies in the blockchain real estate space. And the key thing there is that the real estate assets themselves are not on the network, so they are not on quote unquote the blockchain in this case. There is a centralized registry for digital real estates, or is going to be in the future. And while the process is decentralized and the processing is done on the Dias network, the real estate records themselves are maintained in a centralized database, and that helps compliance things a lot, and it helps risk management also from bank perspective, as the banks handle the house loan and the collateral.
Yeah, so actually the first time we talked to the banks, our idea was that we would put the registry on a blockchain, so that the ownership would also be on a blockchain. But then we soon learned that there was actually a government initiative that was building the centralized registry, and the new law was coming along, and like all the decisions on building that registry had already been made. So we just realized that it doesn't make sense to try to fight this anymore. Let's just try to figure out like if there's another space within this area that we can fit into. And we realized that what the government is building is only building a registry of ownership. They're not building anything around like how the trading process will actually be run. And that's where we realized that that's something that we can make a lot easier.
Okay, so the actual ownership is not registered in Dias. You're only just guaranteeing the transactions, right?
Yeah, so essentially we're facilitating the trading process.
As it should be,
yes,
in my mind.
Yeah.
Now, I want to move us forward a little bit in the story. We could talk about Dias and its features and happy users for a long time, but I want to kind of move us along to the next element in this conversation, which is the story of how this was put together. Sami, you already mentioned that you pitched this to me back in 2017. Now I remember that meeting very clearly. It was a small sushi restaurant close to the bank office where I work. And I guess, you had everything pretty much stacked against you. You were pitching to the largest banks in the region as a very small fintech company at the time. The amount of IP beyond the ideas and talent and ambition that you had at that point was, again, not really much. You had something, but not much. And you were trying to disrupt a well-established market with a quote-unquote blockchain solution. So not an easy start, I would say, especially when you're pitching to large, very conservative banks. I guess there was a lot of elements in terms of the people you were able to locate in these different banks, and you were able to find the right people to move this forward. But now, fast forward to 2020 and this year, the network is not only live with all major banks in Finland involved in the network, but it's also growing fast, like we established in the beginning. There's a lot of reasons why it's growing fast. I guess COVID is impacting that as well. But could you talk about the journey a little bit, Sami? What do you think were the kind of key moments in this story that made it the success that it is today, even before the even greater success, obviously? But where you are today, what do you think were the key moments in making it happen?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that kind of played in our favor was that we didn't know how big of a journey we had in front of us when we started. So of course we like I explained how our company started. We just started doing experimentation and trying to figure out things like figure out businesses that would work. And when we talked about this idea with the banks, we didn't know that this is actually going to succeed and we're gonna move forward with this. So we didn't really look at the big picture of how is this going to play out in the next 5 years or so. What we were thinking is that we're just going to get started with a proof of concept. That's what we were talking with you in the sushi place where we met. That let's do a proof of concept on this. Let's just see if the technology is a good fit for this business problem. And I think that was one of the key things, that we started with a really small chunk and not trying to solve everything at the same time. Let's just try out the technology, see if it works. And the model was a very cooperative model where we'd share the IP and the amounts of money that were it wasn't a costly endeavor for the banks to undertake. Whereas for us as a company that had recently been started, any revenue was good revenue, and I think in that case it was a really good fit. I mean, we got a little revenue for the banks. It was a really small risk to kind of do this proof of concept and not a lot of money, and that's how we kind of got started. And then, of course, when we got started, we actually had to execute. We actually had to get the proof of concept done and see what comes out of it. And then we had a lot of work in trying to figure out how do we do it and how actually writing the code and doing all the architecture work that we needed to set it up. And the proof of concept was actually a really good success. Actually, the largest newspaper in Helsinki, in Finland, actually wrote a huge paper about it, or article about it. And because it was such a success, and because there were two of the largest banks already working together with us on this, and I think that's also, since the very beginning, the whole thing has been built very heavily around collaboration. So it's actually like Tomorrow Tech by itself would never have been able to do this. It's been a collaboration with the banks and with the real estate agents in Finland that we've been able to figure out what's crucial and what's important here. But the proof of concept was the first thing. Then, if we just skip forward a little bit, then we built a beta version where the beta version was more focused on the actual business problems and the business processes. So the POC, the proof of concept, was a technical POC. The beta was more focused on the actual business problems. And then after that, we had the issue of everything is going really well. How do we actually take this into production? And that was an interesting junction of trying to figure out how do we go from this model where we're doing these beta versions into running an actual production system. And that's when we came up with this idea that let's start a joint venture with the banks. And when we when we told our lawyer that we have this idea that we're going to start a joint venture with a bunch of banks, they simply told us that this is never going to happen. It's just like no way that this will ever happen, and because of for essentially for two reasons. One, you're a small startup of 3 people. They're never going to start a joint venture with a small startup like that. It's just like no way. And on top of that, the banks are competitors. They're not going to agree on anything. And because of those reasons, this is never going to work. But we signed the contracts in November in 2018, and we can talk a little more about that process if we want to. But that's how we got the joint venture, and that joint venture is now the entity that is running Dias. And we didn't really get to the numbers, but like 98% of the mortgage market in Finland is on the platform. We're doing 20% of the trades currently in Finland and growing fast.
That's an amazing story. We cannot emphasize enough the success in getting the banks together. Again, like you said, competitors in this space, coming together and building something that was seen as shared infrastructure or a collaborative space between the banks. Yeah, one of the things that struck me in the process when I was there in the different workshops and seeing all of these actors in the real estate market in those workshops coming together and enthusiastically working on this new idea because everybody saw the value of this new solution. I honestly don't know how you made that happen. I've been the in many of these things and people get very nasty very quickly, but for some reason for this project everybody seems to be quite happy. It was not always, of course, like that. I mean, there were moments where we disagreed on things, but mostly I think the overall atmosphere was very positive, and I think that really helped carry this through. How you did it, I have no clue.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that are kind of important to point out there and are related. So I think one of the things is that even though there were competitors in this, like the banks are competitors and the real estate agents are competitors to each other, they're still like the fact remains that actually facilitating the process of a trade is actually, that's not the bank's business. The banks they're not interested in facilitating the process. That the business is actually the mortgages. That's the key business. And for the real estate agents, they're there to sell the apartment. They're not looking at like, how do we do this paperwork? How do we spend like the most amount of our time doing this paperwork? They're also not interested in that. That's something that is something that they have to do, but they prefer not to do if they just could skip it. And that's kind of the area that Dias solves. We're getting rid of bureaucracy in a way. We're getting rid of the process that we need to run, but those are not the competitive advantage for the banks or for the real estate agents. So we're kind of taking away something that no one wants to do in some way. Yeah. And I think that helps, that you're not actually competing on that, even though you are competitors. And then the other thing is that we actually spent a lot of time figuring out how do we run the workshops so that we focus on what's common and what's like not on the conflicts, and trying to figure out what's our common goal, what are the things that everyone will benefit from this. And I think like I did a lot of like facilitation, a lot of coaching work in my previous roles, and I think that helped in setting up the workshops so that we focus on the right things.
Right. Yeah, I think that might have been the secret sauce in making that happen. Who knows? But moving on to some of the, I guess, more of the boring parts of these stories. One of the things that usually takes fintech startups like yourselves under, in the very beginning of their story, is the sheer amount of security and data protection requirements that the banks bury them with. Now you are working with several banks with several sets of requirements, and this is true for any blockchain network that any fintech is building. You have to comply with requirements from so many institutions, and then you have to find the common ground between those things and be able to do that in an efficient way. Now, Paul, you've been from the tech vendor side in these discussions many times, and when we see fintechs struggle with these things, What do you think they could do to be better prepared for this banking requirements for security and data protection?
I think there's a number of things that can be done. I actually really like the story that Sami has and how Dias has sort of evolved. And I think one of the things that has been successful for Dias is the fact that it's, like Sami said, not focused in on the core business of the banks. So the banks see it very quickly as a way to drive additional value. But I think if you look at most fintechs, I'm not sure if Dias is in the same position, although Sami, you did say that you started from the technology upwards. And I think that's one of the areas that fintechs struggle with, is the fact that they are technology companies rather than being banks. And they don't understand financial markets, really. They don't understand the full history of banks, why banks are so regulated the way that they are, what the impact of regulatory compliance is on the banks and on the industry. And they don't understand how the banks got to where the banks are today anyway, to start with, right? And I think I've seen time and time again where fintechs are very active, very eager, very young in their approach and thinking, and they come to the large banks. And the first thing that happens is that the banks dump a 5,000-page contractual document in front of them and say, of course we want to work with you, but it's going to take you 6 months to deal with our lawyers. It's going to take you 5 months to align with our regulatory needs. It's going to take you 3 months to deal with our pressures around data residency, around GDPR, around et cetera, not forgetting PSD2, MiFID 2, etc. And the fintechs get overwhelmed by this because they are floating in a world which is technology focused for them, and outside of that continued pressure of regulators and a heavily regulated industry, and they're trying to get into that. And there's a culture clash almost that happens, right? And I think that if the fintechs can understand the issues and the pressures that the banks are under, that it would help them to engage at the right way. I don't know if you agree with that, Sami, based on your experience engaging with the large banks in Finland.
No, sounds very familiar, and I think one of the things that happened in Dias was that we did this in an iterative fashion. So we first did a proof of concept, then we did a beta version, and everyone knew that those versions are not going to go live. They are never going to process customer data. So we, of course, such systems do not have all the same like compliance requirements that they need to meet, because they're never going to touch any customer data. So in that way, we had time to build the system without getting slammed with all the compliance documentation that's necessary, or all the product approval processes in the very beginning. So we had time to kind of hone the product already before we got to the point where we actually need to pass these processes. And I think at that time, when we kind of got to the point where we actually need to do the proper product approval processes within all of these banks, it's also like, for us, it wasn't just that we're doing it with one bank, we were doing it with a bunch of banks at the same time. So that kind of gives you another level on the whole thing. Instead of just doing one, you're doing 5 simultaneously. And I think the key thing that happened for us at some point during that process, when we like the documentation required for all the product approval stuff, we were really scared, to be honest. We were like, how do we do this? This is crazy, the amount of like stuff that we need to fill out and think about and process, and like also the fact that we have a really small company, whereas we have a bunch of banks who have like whole teams who are kind of working on this. Like, how do we don't have the resources to deal with this. But I think what happened at some point was that we realized that actually, like, most of the stuff is there only just to make sure that you're doing smart things. And if you're doing smart things, you're actually okay. I mean, if you're building something that's secure, and if you're building something that like is GDPR compliant from the scratch, the documentation is actually going to be fairly easy if you're doing that. Then you talk exactly about like what you're doing and how you're doing it, and that will be enough. And when we realized that, then I think like that was like a huge load off our shoulders, when we realized that we just fill out what we're really doing, and that will be enough.
Yeah, I think, be smart and make good decisions in the beginning. It will definitely get you through it. And I think you hit the nail on the head there. The kind of compliance and all the requirements that the banks tend to throw at these fintechs is just to establish trust.
Exactly.
Because banks have the trust of, to a certain extent at least, of the regulator, even though the banks are doing an immense amount of reporting to the regulators because they don't inherently trust the banks. But the customers have the trust that the banks are doing all this stuff. So that's kind of, behind the surface a little bit, all of this checking and trust creation. And I think that's the reason for this kind of asymmetry of kind of work in this space.
Definitely, and I think that's something that kind of both parties, I mean, fintechs and banks, can improve on, is that instead of seeing the compliance and the product approval processes as a process where the banks give you a bunch of documentation to fill out, and then the fintechs fill them out and like post them somewhere. Instead of that, like building more of a dialogue around that makes a lot of sense. So asking questions like that the fintechs and the compliance people actually let's have a meeting and discuss let's walk through some of the questions, explain what's behind some of these questions and what's important in these questions. I think for us, there was a bunch of times where we didn't really even understand the question. We weren't sure what was, because there were so many ways that we could interpret the question. Because of course the questions are also, they're really generic, because they're like standard questions for anything from like IT systems to like something completely different. And for that reason, it was sometimes really hard to know what are they actually asking with this question. And it helped so much when we just called up some of the people in the banks and said can we just have a meeting and let's just walk through some of this stuff and help us understand this. And the banks were really happy to do that. Actually, the compliance people were most of the time really happy to talk to you, really happy that someone actually asks what's behind this.
Yeah.
And after that, when we understood better what are they actually looking for, then of course it's so much easier to answer the questions.
It's always better to collaborate than to compete, right? So.
Yeah.
And I think the banks are moving slowly towards that paradigm where they realize they need to collaborate more, rather than stand as large monolithic organizations that want to compete with the rest of the world.
Yeah. So we could talk about this forever, but we need to move along. The time is flying. So Sami, the last question on Diaz right now. So what's next?
Yeah, so there's at least for the time being, we're still going to be very focused on Finland because there are so many things that we can still build here. But of course, we're kind of scouring or exploring other markets and seeing what would work and what wouldn't work. Essentially, if you look at the real estate space, for example, in the Nordics, at a very high level, it looks like it's very similar in every country, that there are certain steps that happen in Finland and in Sweden and in Norway and so on. And it's very, at a high level, it's similar. But then when you start getting into the nitty-gritty details, the processes differ quite a lot. And in that sense, Diaz is not something that you can that will just flip a switch and now we're open in Sweden. It doesn't work like that. So there's if and when we start expanding to other countries, there's still a bunch of work that we need to do around the processes that are different in each country. But once again, what's kind of, I think, one of the hardest parts in building this whole thing has been to get to a point where we have a platform that has been through all the security testing and all the compliance and all the product approval processes. And when we have that, implementing new processes on top of this platform is a much smaller effort than starting from scratch. And that's something that we do have on our side. But yeah, so currently we still have so much that we can accomplish here in Finland, that we're going to be mostly focused on Finland, but the vision of Diaz has actually always been that we're aiming to automate the whole real estate trade execution, so that the payments, for example, happen automatically. And that's something that we're already trying to explore, like how do we actually get to that point, that we're making progress there. And that's I think that's really great, because at some point we could get to a point where, like, when the real estate agent starts a new trade in Diaz, it'll take 2 minutes for the whole execution to be done. And that's what I want us to get to.
That's a really ambitious plan, knowing the complexities around that topic. But yeah, it's an interesting story. And I think we discussed about the blockchain stuff a couple of episodes ago. And I think, hearing what you're saying, Sami, is kind of proof to many of the things we talked about. For example, blockchain is never a replacement for the existing law. So the legal framework pretty much defines how the network needs to work, and there are certain compliance requirements that you need to do, and you just cannot airdrop a blockchain on a business and then expect it to work and be compliant. And I think the things you said about the foundation being there is a good starting point, and I think that's a good kind of stepping stone for scaling up. But there's going to be a lot of interesting work ahead in understanding how do these processes work in each country, because they are inherently different.
Yeah. And I think in general, just as a comment on the blockchain space in general, I think, like you said, you can't just airdrop stuff into place. You have to take into account the regulation and all the existing stuff that's already there. And I think in that sense, most of the stuff that you see in the blockchain space is too idealistic, in my opinion. Yeah. That we need more companies who are exactly trying to figure out, like, what can we do within these constraints, that we do have these constraints, what can we do within these? I mean, I'm not saying, like, it's okay to have an idealistic company, that's totally fine. But I think we need more companies who are trying to figure out businesses that operate within the constraints that we have.
Yeah. And that's an excellent segue to our end of episode story that we want to talk about. Because Facebook and Libra did something interesting. They didn't really make too much noise with this, but they actually rebranded their Calibra wallet to what they call now Novi. I hope I pronounced that correctly, because it's not Finnish. And as most of our listeners would know, Calibra was and is Facebook's wallet project for the upcoming Libra network. If successful, Facebook users could easily be onboarded to the Calibra, or now Novi wallet, and then allow them to easily send and receive money using the Libra network. But now they changed their name. Novi. What? Why? Any thoughts? Why the rebranding? Sami, Paul?
I can see the reason why, to a certain degree, right? Calibra and Libra, the names are very similar. They give a feeling that the two are connected tightly together. But when you actually look at it, right, the Libra network is not a Facebook network. It's a consortium set up outside of Facebook, and Facebook are trying very hard to distance themselves from Libra. Now, whether that is because of Facebook's reputation, etc., that's a different discussion. But renaming their wallet, which is their wallet, right, that will interact with the Libra network, I can understand doing that. It's a marketing exercise more than anything else, from my perspective.
Yeah, it sounds exactly the same to me. It's simply PR that Facebook has been getting most of the bad reputation that has come from the issues that Libra has been facing, and they simply they don't like the fact that they're getting all of that when there are also other companies behind Libra, and they kind of want to separate that out. I think it's actually a really good move from Facebook to do that, because I get the fact that they don't want all of the bad press when there's also others involved.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And an interesting story, actually, that I read this morning, which is that WhatsApp is finally launching Facebook Pay enabled P2P payments on the WhatsApp application, and this is not based on Libra or Novi in any shape or form. They are actually starting in I think they're starting now in Brazil first, and they are kind of going through the usual processes of complying with requirements, because they're using traditional rails like debit and credit cards to make these P2P payments. And it would have been interesting to be in the boardroom having that conversation at Facebook that we're going to do this P2P payments, but we're not going to use Libra or Novi for that. There's an interesting comparison as well. It's called Novi. I used to work a lot with Nokia in my previous life, and they, if anybody remembers, they launched their Ovi services without an N, and yes. Everybody knows how that goes. So let's see if there's a connection there or not. All right. Any closing thoughts on this?
No. Good luck to Facebook and good luck to Libra.
All right, cool. So unfortunately, my friends, as always, time flies when you're having fun. I think it was a bit of a longer episode this time. Let's see how it comes out of the editing. But I think it was a very, very interesting discussion with you, Sami, and another part of this chapter in the story of the podcast called Fintech Daydreaming. But before we close, though, Sami, I would like to give you a chance for our listeners to find out how can they find out more about you, and where can they find out more about Dias and Tomorrow Tech.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Sami Honkonen. Dias, you can find dias.fi. Tomorrow Tech, you can find at tomorrow.fi.
Perfect. And thank you for coming to the show. Your insights were surely valuable for all our listeners today.
No, thanks a lot for having me.
And thank you to our listeners as well. Now, do you have a fintech subject that me and Paul could cover in a future episode? Or maybe you have a great story to share and would like to join us as a guest. Ping us on LinkedIn or on our anchor.fm page and let us know. And see you all next time. This has been Fintech Daydreaming.